Hello everyone and welcome back to JT on the Go. Today we are going to visit the National Museum of African American History and Culture, located in Washington, D.C., the United States capital. It opened on September 24th, 2016. Before we get into detail about the visit, it is very important that you try to plan far in advance as possible, because this is a very high demand ticket. To get your free time entry visit, go to www.nmahc.si.edu. Once you get to this page, click Free Time Entry Passes to begin the process. The museum starts at the very bottom and we will be working our way up top. Very symbolic to the African slave's journey in a land where all men are supposed to be created equal. This is a three-part series of the museum where we will be talking about the true journey of African slaves in American history, an important history. In part 1, we will be talking about African American history from 1400 to 1877. In this part, we will be covering slavery to Reconstruction. When the Europeans began colonizing the New World, they began enslaving African slaves from Africa into the Americas to serve as slaves on the farm. This was part of the triangular trade on the Atlantic Ocean. The slaves were loaded onto the lower levels of ships like animals and brought from Africa. The journey took a long time, and they were told to sit in a very uncomfortable position. Some had died on the way. There were no bathrooms for them to use, hardly a cruise ship. These are the cuffs that they put on the children. The very small ones that you see on the top were for infants, while the larger ones were for older children. Here's a model of the slaves on the ship. The way that they treated them was absolutely horrible. They were basically being treated like livestock. As you can see, the ships were packed with them. Imagine sitting in your waist and the waist of others for months. There were multiple European countries participating in the triangular trade, specifically ones that colonized the Americas like Spain, Portugal, and Great Britain. This is a picture of the route they traveled on. For the slaves who survived, they were forced to work on the farms in the Americas to produce goods. Then these goods were loaded onto ships to be taken back to Europe. These are some of the goods that were in the Columbian Exchange. After that, the ships would leave Europe and come back to Africa and repeat the process again. On the farm, the black slaves were owned by white people who made them work on the farm. They were not allowed to learn, read, or write. The owners also raped women, children, and whipped the men. When the 13 colonies were formed, most slavery activity occurred in the South. But make no mistake about it, the North was far from integrated. Even the Declaration of Independence did not live to what it actually meant at the time. African slaves had fought in the American Revolution for both the colonist side and the British side. Both enslaved and free Africans fought in the Revolution. But in the Boston Massacre, one of the colonists killed was a slave that was set free. His name was Crispus Attucks. Some of the founding fathers did own slaves. For example, Thomas Jefferson, who wrote the Declaration of Independence, said that all men were created equal, but Jefferson still owned slaves. They even built Monticello where Jefferson lived. Another example would be George Washington, the first U.S. president. He owned slaves, but he didn't set them free until after he died. The slavery problem was getting worse over time. When the U.S. began the Monroe Doctrine, northern states were based off industry, because the Industrial Revolution had made them switch from farming to manufacturing, and the North had more railroads. But the North still allowed white people to own slaves. The South was based on agriculture and benefited from slavery, but the South had less factories and railroads. The crop that they were harvesting the most at this time was cotton. In the North and South, there were laws that prohibited slaves from owning land and leaving slave owners without their permission. At this very time, slave trade has been outlawed, so the slave owners couldn't buy any more slaves. But the high birth rate from raped enslaved women kept the slave population growing. It was divided because of this nation, and its founding fathers never believed Africans to be men but animals. Africans were ranked second to last out to the Native Americans, which they made almost extinct. As new states were added, they had to make the number of states equal. This created a number of disputes. One of them was in Kansas, which became Bleeding Kansas because people were killing each other over the issue. Then Kansas became a free state, which is the North. An example of these states being equal is when California became a free state, Texas became a slave state, and you wonder why this country is divided today. During all this, some slaves actually escaped to the North on the Underground Railroad. The underground part meant secret. Railroad was code language. Conductor helping slaves escape, passengers fleeing for freedom, and stations where they stayed after a leg. This mainly happened at night, but the journey wasn't easy. It would be over 1,000 miles from wherever the slaves were. To escape, some slaves had to avoid main roads and hide in swamps to avoid being captured by their owners. This was hardly the benefit. To get there faster, some had to stow away in boats, wagonways, and trains. One example was Henry Box Brown. He mailed himself from Virginia to Pennsylvania. He was in the box for over 24 hours until he was opened in Philadelphia. Upon arriving, some slaves had pictures taken of their backs because they were brutally whipped by their owners, but some of them faced discrimination in the North. When Congress passed the Fugitive Slave Act, this was deemed worthy for the slave owners in the South because they were not thrilled with the Underground Railroad. For Northerners, it was a kick in the guts. The law stated that if a slave escaped to the North, the locals of the North had to bring him or her back to their owner. The most well-known conductor of the Underground Railroad was Harriet Tubman. She was born as a slave in Maryland but later escaped to Pennsylvania. After that, she helped more and more slaves escape, and boy, she never got caught. But if you did get caught, you would get punishments for doing it. But helping slaves escape is the right thing to do. Harriet and Frederick Douglass were both abolitionists, along with William Lloyd Garrison, who was best known for his widely read anti-slavery newspaper. When President Abraham Lincoln was elected, the slave states seceded from the northern states and formed the Confederacy, while the North was the Union. Then the Civil War began. African Americans fought for the Union. Approximately 180,000 African Americans had comprised 163 units in the Union Army during the Civil War, and many more African Americans served in the Union Navy. Despite their service, they were not treated as equals to their white counterparts. During the war, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. Most people thought it freed all slaves, but it turns out it only freed slaves in the South. But Lincoln let the North keep their slaves. He later met with Frederick Douglass in the White House. After the war, Congress passed the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery forever. Slavery has been going on for hundreds of years at this point. The 14th Amendment said all men are created equal. The 15th Amendment says that black people can vote. Despite these laws, blacks were still not treated equally nor given the same opportunities as whites. Another thing that happened after the Civil War was the Reconstruction time. This started the era of segregation, which we will cover in the next episode.